The early season is here, and if you are like me, you have been itching to get back out into the woods. Now, the early season can be a bit tricky. The weather is still warm, the bugs are still out, the deer are still holding on to their summer patterns, but they aren't as pressured yet. But with the right approach, you can set yourself up for success even before the pre-rut begins. So in this video, we're going to go over 3 tried and true tips for the early season, like what your overall plan should be during the early season, whether you should hunt mornings or evenings, and how to pick the right stand for this time of the year. So stick around because we've got some solid advice that'll help you make the most of your early season hunts. But before we go over these tips, do me a favor, and if this is your first time on my channel, hit that subscribe button and make sure you click that bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload a video. I'd also like to thank one of my new channel sponsors, Arrow Precision. And I know I said in my last video that YouTube's new guidelines on firearms stuff would keep me from sharing some of these new sponsors, but I read through the policy again. Actually, I read through it like 2 or 3 times just to make sure I understood it. And I even reached out to YouTube to ask them if these specific sponsors are okay per the new guidelines. And they said, and I quote, "Our internal guidelines prohibit us from providing any editorial advice regarding this matter." So in other words, we can't tell you if these sponsors violate our guidelines or not. You'll figure that out when you get a strike. And since this isn't my full-time job and I just do this for fun, I'll just send it and we'll see what happens. And so if you're looking for high quality parts for your next rifle build, whether that's a smaller caliber like 5.56 for predator hunting or a bigger caliber like 308 for bigger game, make sure you check out Arrow Precision. They're who I used to build mine, and it has been flawless. They machine their parts in a state-of-the-art factory and are one of the most trusted brands out there. From upper and lower receivers to bulk carrier groups, their parts are engineered for maximum performance and durability, ensuring that your build is ready for whatever it's intended for. Whether you're building a custom AR or upgrading for accuracy, Arrow Precision provides the parts that you need for a flawless build. Visit them at the link below and experience the difference. And the first early deer season tip is deer season is long. Don't act like it's your only chance to get a deer. Unless it is, and then you might ignore all this. When we talk about high percentage days in deer hunting, we are often referring to those days when deer are more likely to be active and moving. Specifically, bucks are going to be up on their feet during daylight hours. And during the early season, we have to be cautious and hunt smart. Otherwise, we run the risk of making the rest of the deer season much harder on ourselves. And one of the best ways to pick those high percentage days to deer hunt is to watch the weather. Weather is one of the biggest influences on deer movement, and deer are very sensitive to changes in temperature, pressure, and wind. So when we're trying to find these high percentage days, what is it we should exactly be looking for? The first thing you should look for are cold fronts. During the early season, temperatures are still pretty high. Often the high is in the 70s, 80s, depending where you are, sometimes even the 90s. So when you're watching the weather, look for those significant drops in temperature. And by significant, I mean like 15 degrees or so. If you find one coming up in the next few days, you better plan some time to be out in the woods. Those cooler temperatures can trigger deer to get up on their feet and start feeding earlier. So those bucks that have been waiting till well after dark to go out into those food plots or other feeding areas are more likely to be up on their feet during shooting hours. Another factor to look for is rising or steady pressures at around 30 inches of mercury or so. So if you've got rising pressure after a front moves through or something, or a storm, something like that, or you've got more than a few days of that steady 30 inches of mercury pressure, that's often a green light for deer activity. So in the early season, make sure you're picking those high percentage days if you can. Sometimes you don't have a choice. The early season is all you've got to hunt. You're limited on your time, and so you don't have a whole lot of options. But even if there's not a cold front moving through or that pressure isn't perfect, deer do still have to eat. Which brings us to tip number 2. And during the early season, those evening hunts are going to be your best and safest bet. During the early season, deer are still on their summer feeding patterns. They're often bedding down during the hot part of the day, and then as the sun starts to set, those cooler temperatures start to come in, deer are going to get up on their feet and start feeding. But in the mornings, they're typically already at those destination food sources, so you're more likely to bump them as you're coming into the stand because they're leaving those food sources earlier. They're not waiting until the sun comes up or an hour or 2 afterwards like they would, in the winter or in the rut. They're trying to get to these cooler places before it gets hot. In the evenings, you're typically in your stands 2 hours before the sun starts to set. Kind of depends on your preference there. But you're in your stand before the deer are even triggered to get up to start moving to these food sources. They're waiting till that temperature starts to drop a little bit before they get out there. And so the big thing here is to make sure that you're set up in the right stand and you're paying attention to the wind and especially those thermals. Because like I said, those bucks are going to be, or those deer, not just bucks, are going to be down in the bottoms in the shade where they can get some breeze running through so they can keep cool. And if those thermals and those cooling temperatures are really sucking that scent down into those bottoms, you're done. So a really good setup here is if you can set up near water. That's always a good thing because it's going to be hot. They need to drink some more. But if you can make sure you're set up to where the thermals are going to be sucking your scent down to like a south facing slope, something like that, because deer are more likely going to be on those north, those east facing slopes where they can get a little more shade. So you're less likely to have deer coming up behind you. They're going to, like I said, in the shade, in the breeze to keep cool. So they're going to be coming up from in front of you and not circling around behind you where your scent's coming down. So the third early season tip is to make sure you're just hunting the right stands at the right time. You want to be as low impact as possible in the early season. That means not picking stands to where you have to walk through some known bedding areas or having to walk deep into the property. It also means you shouldn't be hunting those bedding areas just yet. I know those are great places to hunt, but only during the pre-rut and rut when you're trying to catch those bucks cruising those areas for receptive does. If you stick your stinky face in those areas too often, too soon, you're going to ruin them for the rest of the season. During the early season, I like to think that I'm doing more active scouting. Yes, I want to see deer every time that I go out there and hunt. Everybody does. However, if you go in thinking that you need to make something happen, it kind of goes back to the things we talked about earlier. If you think you need to make something happen, you're going to push too far too soon. So if you stay on the outskirts, like if you want to hunt near those bedding areas, and if you can find them on those north slopes, something like that, that's going to have a lot more shade, you want to stay farther back. And then as you get more successive hunts in there, you can kind of work your way in. You're kind of honing in on those better spots. Don't go running in right off the bat. And so once you pick those high percentage days, like we talked about earlier, then you need to find those areas that have active current deer patterns. So you're looking, if you've got cameras up, you're looking for, you see deer coming across your camera every day, every few days in these specific areas. You got fresh tracks, fresh droppings, good browse. Those are the things you're looking for in the early season. It doesn't matter if you're hunting those really high percentage days. You got, I don't even know how you quantify it, but even if there's like a 99% chance deer are up and moving where you're wanting to go hunt, but you're picking spots that deer don't like to go, it doesn't matter. You're not going to see anything. Also look for transition areas. You've got saddles, benches, anything like that are going to funnel down deer movement into specific areas. One thing I'm trying to focus in on more this year is those secondary edges, those edges that are past those primary edges, which, secondary is after primary. Think of a primary edge as like the tree line along a field or a food plot. It's food plot and then hard edge. And then a secondary edge would be like deeper in those hardwoods is a cedar patch. That line there, that's a secondary edge. Or it could even be, a bunch of trees fell down there and now you've got a bunch of structure on the ground. There's some sunlight coming in. It's probably a good bedding area, but I'm trying to focus in on those secondary edges. There can also be secondary edges in fields. Think of like a large CRP field or old field management type of situation where it's a lot of bunch grasses, switchgrass, stuff like that. And then you've got like a patch of like briars and thick, nasty stuff. That's also a good secondary edge. So that was 3 tips for hunting the early season. Stick to the basics in the early season and you will be on deer. If you've got any more early season tips you'd like to share, make sure you leave those down in the comments below. Hit that like button if you like this video, share it if you found it helpful, and make sure that you are subscribed so you can stay informed.